Hello, everybody. Andrew Field here. I think that between this quarantine and school ending, it's really helped make me post videos more often. So I'm happy about that. I wanted to talk about the protests because, of course, we've all seen it in the news. It's a very big deal. I think that with the COVID crisis still being a crisis, and hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, black and white, and you know, every race coming out to protest um, police brutality and standing up for the black citizens of our country. I think that speaks volumes that they would risk COVID-19 because they feel that it's so important. I think that speaks volumes, and I I'm glad that they're protesting because something needs to change. People like George Floyd shouldn't have died at the hands of police, and they shouldn't have died the way he did. So I hope that something does change from this, and that we come out better as a society after this. So let's get into it. 7 people were shot in protests in Louisville, Kentucky over Breonna Taylor. She was an EMT that was shot 8 times in March by police after 3 officers entered her Kentucky apartment by force to serve a search warrant in a narcotics investigation. So she was another one. Three very important names that happened recently were George Floyd, Ahmed Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And there's been I think there was a shooting also in another city. I saw that happened I think last night or 2 nights ago, but there hasn't been too much shooting, so that's a good sign at least. Kentucky governor uh, was hung in effigy. It was a hateful like sign, I guess, during a gun rights rally. The man who hung the effigy was fired from his job, which was good. Trump called the protesters thugs and suggested the looters should be shot. And he denied knowing that the origin of that phrase was actually used in the 60s and it was a racist phrase. He knew what he was talking about, even if he denies it. And yeah, it's really amazing to see the difference between what he said about black people standing up for their rights versus the people in Michigan that were protesting COVID-19. Because to those people, he said they're like very good people. Um, the governor of Michigan should make a deal. But to African American people who are standing up for their rights and against police brutality, he's called them thugs, and he said the phrase, if there's a looting, there's shooting, or something like that, which is a very racist phrase. Something you would expect out of Trump, but bad even for him. Joe Biden called out Trump's reaction to the tragedy, and Joe Biden's been doing a very good job with this in trying to spread the message of hope. He knew what's been going on, and I think he's done a really good job with this, unlike Trump. Twitter said Trump's tweet glorified violence and flagged it. Um, yeah, there's been 6 days of protests so far. There definitely will be a seventh today. Minneapolis police station was set on fire. A CNN reporter and crew were arrested live in Minneapolis. The crew was released, and the Minnesota governor apologized, but I think that would make people more angry, and it should, that it was a black reporter from CNN, and that they were arrested for covering what was going on, and they arrested that reporter before they arrested any of the police officers that were involved in the killing of George Floyd. That's the problem we have with the police system today. And I'm with the protesters, by the way. I don't know if I've said that, but I definitely am with the protesters. I can't imagine what they had to go through with all of this, with everything going on. But I definitely stand with the protesters for um, their message against police brutality, and I stand for them wanting to have equal rights as everybody else. The officer, Derek Chauvin, one of the former officers fired for his involvement in George Floyd's death, um, he was actually the main officer, the one that was stepping on George Floyd's neck. Um, sorry, I don't know why you're seeing my head. He, he was fired, and actually all four of the officers were fired, and he was actually taken into custody. Was the main officer. Like I said, he was charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter, but a lot of people weren't happy with the charges. Seemed like it should have been first-degree murder, and I agree with that. The White House was on lockdown due to protests. Trump said he spoke to George Floyd's family. CNN actually interviewed George Floyd's family, and it seemed like, they said that Trump only spoke with them for 2 minutes. Meanwhile, Joe Biden had a meaningful conversation that lasted 10 to 15 minutes, and Trump did not call Ahmaud Arbery's family. He tweeted about him, but he did not call the family, and that was Ahmaud was murdered in February, so the mother said she didn't want to talk to Trump if he were to call her now. Trump said he wanted the Department of Justice to investigate the murder, but since the Department of Justice is highly corrupt now, it doesn't seem like it'd make much of a difference. Just seemed to be a political move. Protests happened all over America. They, of course, were strong in Minneapolis, excuse me, but they were also in New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court rejected an appeal from a Louisiana inmate who argued from a Louisiana. Sorry, I wrote that twice. The Louisiana inmate argued against a state prison was not doing well enough to protect him from COVID-19, and the Supreme Court dismissed his case. And I think that was wrong because obviously prisons are like the worst places. So to just reject it without even going into the case was wrong. Minnesota imposed a curfew on May 29th from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. There was no law enforcement at night to enforce the curfew. Excuse me. Protesters ran wild. It was kind of like anarchy that night. Officials in Minnesota alleged that those leading the destruction in places like the Twin Cities are not locals, but CNN said most of the people arrested were from Minnesota, so it seemed kind of like a conflicting info. But I do believe that white supremacists out there are looting and causing violence because they know that the black people will be blamed for it. So I think the white supremacists are actually causing a lot of the violence, um, which is really sad. But what can you expect out of white supremacists? Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announced he was fully mobilizing the National Guard. The National Guard has been mobilized in places like my home state, Illinois, as well. I think it's been in a dozen states they've been mobilized. American intelligence officials exclaim that Russian intelligence services are trying to incite violence with white supremacist groups to sow chaos in the United States. Now, I fully believe that in American intelligence, and I can't believe that it's true, but that just shows how much Russia tries to get into our system, how much they hate us, and how bad of a country they are. Um, Protesters knocked down White House security barricades as anger mounted over the George Floyd's death. Barack and Michelle Obama weighed in on George Floyd's death and how painful it was. The NYPD ran cars into protesters, which was insane. I saw the video. Far-right extremists are hoping to turn the George Floyd protests into a new civil war. Instead of addressing the nation like any president would, Trump threw a MAGA night as protests happened in all major cities. And you know what? This is what people deserve for electing Donald Trump. This is what was going to happen. All these protests and stuff over inequalities while the president sits in a White House and says nothing. He did not tweet for the protesters. He actually tweeted against them. And he did not address the nation like a president would, because Trump is not a president. He's the worst president we've ever had. I mean, he is a president, but he's not a good president. He doesn't know what he's doing. Um, the unlikeliest of forces joined the protesters. The Amish and a hacker group, Anonymous, have come together to support them. Some protests were peaceful, and the networks did not seem to cover that. It seemed like some networks were doing better than others, like NBC seemed to actually talk about it, but I looked at CNN and they did not seem to do a good job of showing the good things going on. They only seem to show the bad, so I have to shout them out for that. In Colorado's capital, crowd in the thousands chants "I can't breathe." Um, they also laid down for 9 minutes shouting "I can't breathe," like um, in memorial of him. Nearly 1,400 people were arrested, and that was from like 2 days ago, so that's probably a lot higher. Uh, there's fears of a second coronavirus wave from all the people that are marching. So if you are marching and protesting, um, I personally want to, but I feel like, it's just too big of a risk with COVID. So I'm trying to do my part and express my thoughts on social media, but especially when it's thousands of people, I feel like people definitely need to be wearing face masks to protect themselves and the other people. But I feel like face masks aren't enough when there's thousands of people. So I feel like a lot of people will still get infected, sadly. Um, Michael Jordan said on George Floyd's death, "We have had enough." Target temporarily closed stores across the U.S., and Target will pay employees for up to 14 days while stores are closed. A great thing I saw was thousands gathered in London, went to the U.S. Embassy to support the U.S. protests. The protests also happened in Toronto and Berlin. So, great thing that our allies are with us on these protests. Joe Biden was actually out with protesters and he had meaningful conversations with them, and he seemed to do what a leader would do. So, I was really happy about that. Huntington Beach was in the news a couple weeks ago. I may have said this in the previous video. There was a large crowd protesting the coronavirus lockdowns that are actually saving lives. Um, but they were able to do it without any restrictions or anything like that. But people protesting police violence were called an unlawful assembly. And to those local leaders, you're probably racist. Those local leaders, I'm calling them out for being racist. The local leaders of Huntington Beach. Because a bunch of white people that went out to protest lockdowns, something that's actually helping people, they were fine with. But when it's black people protesting police violence after a man was killed wrongfully, they called an unlawful assembly. It's the same amount of people. There's probably more actually with the lockdown protests, but it's really sad to see. The Secret Service rushed Trump to an underground White House bunker as protests outside the White House intensified. Trump is against anti-fascists, said Antifa will be designated a terrorist organization. Experts believe that is unconstitutional. China trolls U.S. over protests after the U.S. criticized China's actions with Hong Kong. Not the same thing, China, but nice try. Um, there was a blackout in D.C. last night. There was smoke near the Washington Monument, and then the media was kind of shut down. So I don't think that's very democratic. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. I like how the Atlanta mayor put it. She said that Trump was throwing matches to the flames, and I think that's entirely true. Um, and I think she's also been against the violence of the protest. Researchers found high levels of COVID-19 in Florida wastewater. President Trump said that he was removing the U.S. from the World Health Organization over its response to the coronavirus. He said China owns the WHO, even though the U.S. paid a lot more. Trump said the U.S. will no longer treat Hong Kong as separate from China. I like how he put Hong Kong on the national spotlight. This was a couple days ago. A Chinese general said that, let's see, Sorry, I put that in wrong. A Chinese general said China would attack Taiwan to stop it from becoming independent. Um, Drive-in concerts are popping up in the U.S. and Europe. It seems like that could be the future of concerts, at least for a year or two. Um, were accidentally throwing out their stimulus checks because they looked like junk mail. So if that's still coming out, please be aware of that. Um, Historic SpaceX rocket launched successfully after it was delayed earlier in the week. It was the first human launch from U.S. soil since 2011. It was SpaceX working on a NASA mission. The astronauts ended up going to the International Space Station. Merkel, Germany's chancellor, declined Trump's invitation to the G summit in Washington, D.C., citing the pandemic, and that was before the protests, so probably not. But Trump then invited Putin, and what the hell? Putin's not part of the G7, but that's Trump. I don't even want to get into that because that would make me very angry, because that's just really uncalled for. The NHL plans to test players daily if games resume. And I wanted to end it with a really good thing that New York Governor Cuomo did. He signed into law that a law that increases benefits to the families of medical staff, police officers, transit workers, and other public employees who died while on the job from COVID-19. I just wanted to say before I go that I think the protesters, I'm with them, and I hope that this ends well and that the system actually changes this time. And I also wanted to say that it seems like Trump canceled the coronavirus briefings. He's not talking about coronavirus anymore. He's a bad leader, so you have to expect that. But just because Trump is not talking about coronavirus does not mean that coronavirus has gone away. The last I saw it, we are at 105,000 deaths, and although the death rate daily has been going down, it probably will go back up because of the protests and because people are not thinking that COVID is still a problem. COVID will be a problem until we have a vaccine. That is the only way that COVID will not be a problem. So please be careful. Please wear masks when you need to. Please social distance and don't go in big crowds. Um, and if you are going to be in big crowds because of the protests, please try and be safe about it. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Thank you.